Thank you. Just going back to Mr. Knibb, is he now intending to speak just on drainage and flooding, or not at all?
The email I received from Mr. Hands was that I believe he's probably not expecting to do that at all now.
Right.
However, I can cover his points.
Okay, that's fine. The one that I got, or the planning inspector got, was 11:49, so maybe it's moved on since then. But that's fine. Thank you. Right. That is everything in terms of housekeeping. So over to Sir Roger, please.
Thank you very much indeed, sir, and good afternoon. I start by saying that I'm not expert in this by any means, so if I get out of order, I'm quite sure that you'll tell me so. I will endeavour not to go over all the ground that's been already covered this morning, but I'm afraid there will be some repetition in what I have to say. I want to underscore some of the points that have been made. I understand, sir, that this inquiry is application specific in the sense that it relates to very specifically the Gladman proposal. But as Councillor Kerry Boyd said this morning, there is a domino effect in all of this. And it's virtually impossible for us locally to extricate this specific planning application from the effect that it will have on a number of assets locally that cover the whole of not just Shottendane, Shottendane, but Garlinge and Westgate and Birchington. And I hope I won't be out of order in treading slightly on that turf. In your question to Pauline Farrance, you referenced the local plan, and I'd like to comment upon that in a moment, because I think it is relevant, and I think the fact that you have to take account, obviously, of what is in the local plan is significant, and we need to clear that up. I'm indebted to Rowan Dixon from the SWRA and also to Mrs. Brown from Westgate and Garlinge for their presentations, which makes my job a bit easier. Dealing first with the issue of affordable housing, the fundamental ground for the TDC rejection of this application, and the matter of viability, it's a very considerable concern to me that this piece of the jigsaw, the Thanet jigsaw, and indeed others, as I will show, have effectively been motivated by road funding. There is a very real concern that in order to secure the necessary Section 106 funding to build, to widen bits of the local infrastructure, we're sacrificing the requirement for affordable housing. And insofar as Thanet has a housing need, very much of that need is in the affordable area. And of course, much of it, it's not an area that I expect you to know, sir, but it is being built at Westwood Cross. So we're left with a situation where, not for the first time, in order to build a couple of bits of road around the end of the Shottendane Road, opposite the Margate Cemetery, leading down to what used to be known as Coffin House Corner, we're sacrificing land that should not be sacrificed. I suspect that in this domino effect, we shall find exactly the same thing happening as is happening here, with proposals for housing to the rear of Garlinge, to the rear of Westgate-on-Sea, to the rear of Birchington, and then down to what is known as Brooks End Hill, where there will be a huge roundabout. So we're in the perverse situation of trying to fund a needed road, there's no doubt about that, to relieve the traffic that is currently running along the Canterbury Road, which is the only arterial road at the moment running from Brooks End Hill right through into Margate. And in order to relieve the pressure on that road, we're going to build a lot more houses to fund a road which that traffic, new traffic, will then use. And that seems to me to be utterly perverse. The road is needed, but not at the price of a lot of agricultural land. And again, I'll come on to that in a moment, if I may. The infrastructure in the area, this was referred to by Councillor Pauline Farrance, and she's absolutely right, is woefully inadequate. Not only this particular road, which is not funded yet. The government has indicated some funding, and Kent County Council is clearly seeking to raise the wind to do the whole job, but it is by no means in the bag. It is not only that road, it is feeder roads, it's roundabouts. It is, as Pauline Farrance said, very much GP practices and services and health services, and a relatively pitiful contribution by way of Section 106 money to help build a doctor's surgery is going to be of small value if we can't put nurses and doctors into that practice. And at the moment we can't. There is a desperate shortage already. And the more housing we build, the worse that situation is going to get. We also have to look at the provision for education, particularly primary education in the area. And we have to look at the transport facilities as well. And again, as has been pointed out, public transport in this area is pretty sparse. And there's no reason to suppose that in the short to medium term, it's likely to get any better. So basically, we're talking about building a lot more housing, this development and several others, without the supporting infrastructure. And this has been one of my constant criticisms of successive government plans, that the infrastructure simply isn't in place before we add more housing, which is not to say that there isn't some housing needed, because there is. Turning to the matter of the local plan that you put to Pauline Farrance, as I'm sure you are aware, this local plan was imposed upon the government by Sajid Javid when he was the Secretary of State for Local Government. It was therefore not really a local plan. The team from Whitehall came down, told the local authority what we were going to have, and that was then effectively rubber stamped by Thanet District Council. It was the subject of an inquiry with a planning inspector, I don't think it was you, who not entirely surprisingly approved the local plan, and the Secretary of State then approved what was effectively his plan anyway. So this was not a local plan. It wasn't something that local people were involved in really or wanted. The objections, and I was merely one of the many objectors to the local plan before it was approved, were not heeded. The housing figures, 17,500 new houses, were based on outdated ONS figures from 2014. And the requirement for housing for local people in Thanet is probably about half between now and 2030 of what is actually being provided for. Not entirely surprisingly, that's put a huge amount of pressure upon the local authorities to try to identify land upon which to build these houses. In fact, most of our demand can be met and should be met by brownfield sites. Turning to the specific site, historically, I'm surprised that in Kent County Council's submission, they did not refer to the 1973 floods. This is an area that is liable to flooding. Those of us with perhaps rather longer memories than we will wish know very well the difficulties that we've had surrounding the Tivoli Brook and its effluent pouring out into the main sands of Margate. It's now in a culvert, and people have tapped into that culvert. Nobody's quite sure who owns it, who is responsible for it, or where the manure, because that's what it is coming from. It's not particularly pleasant. This issue was addressed, and CCTV cameras were put down the tube within my parliamentary lifetime, so within the last 38 years. Not entirely a satisfactory solution, but the fact of the matter is that the proposed site is effectively a valley and a natural watercourse. And the rainwater, surface water, runs down that valley through the Plenty Brook, through the Tivoli Brook, and out to sea. It is liable to flooding. It was last flooded in June 2021, so not that long ago. And I cannot see from the proposals that are being put forward by the developer any satisfactory mitigation that is going to solve the flooding problem, either now or for the future. That leads us on, sir, to the issue that again has been raised already about sewage. Far too frequently in the last two summer seasons, Margate Main Sands and various of the bays of Thanet have been subjected to pollution from raw sewage released into the sea by Southern Water, because the only alternative was to allow that sewage to back up into people's homes and gardens. And there is at least one area in Thanet near Acol where that actually happens, or has happened, on a reasonably regular basis, because the pump continually fails. And that's not a pretty sight either. So Southern Water have done, most recently, frequently, what they've had to do, which is to release raw sewage into the sea to prevent flooding in people's homes. That in turn has fouled the beaches, and we've had thousands and thousands of pounds worth of bad publicity as a result, which of course at the height of the tourist season, which has already been fairly rocky for the last couple of years, has been singularly distressing for those trying to make a living out of tourism. The sewage situation as it stands is not sustainable, as it stands. Back in, I think, 1983, I declared open personally, and somewhere, God help me, there's my name on a plate on the door of the Fourness Point sewage works. And that was supposed to be the state-of-the-art facility that was going to solve all Thanet's sewage problems and prevent the use of a short sea outfall. But in those days, of course, long sea outfalls were still permitted. They're not now, thank God. It's become apparent since that as we've added more and more housing into Thanet, the system simply cannot cope. For why? Because, and I had this explained to me by Southern Water's engineers very recently after the most recent incident. We actually went into it in some grim detail. Fact of the matter is that the surface water from the roads and the roofs goes into the same system that carries the sewage. When you get the kind of storms that we've had in the last few years, and particularly in the last few months, the system simply becomes overwhelmed. The storm drains cannot cope, and the only solution is to release raw sewage into the sea. Now, if they can't cope now, and the system is going to take millions of pounds and many years to resolve, because the only way to resolve this is to separate out rainwater from foul water. None of the houses proposed, as I understand it, have grey water systems, for instance. Each and every one of those has a roof that will drain off onto the land, mostly onto tarmac, which will then drain into the roads. This is a relatively modest development. Even this one is going to add to an already very bad problem. And that is why, one of the reasons why Craig McKinley and I can't remember, I think it may have been Mrs. Smith, said Craig McKinley and I have called for a moratorium on house building until we've sorted out the sewage issues for the whole of the Isle of Thanet, because we cannot go on as we are. And perversely, again, what we're seeking to do is to add more and more and more roofs and more tarmac drives and more roads and gullies pouring into an already inadequate sewage system. So I would argue very strongly the combination of the capacity for the site to flood, together with the failure of the sewage system to be able to cope, militates very heavily indeed against this development, and indeed others, which we shall no doubt find ourselves having to oppose in due course, whether or not this one goes through. The final area that I want to cover is agricultural land. I have spent many months now doing battle with successive secretaries of state and indeed with the Prime Minister to try to protect our farmland, which is part of our local heritage. And I'll come back to that again in a moment. Thanet historically has been an agricultural area. Probably 3/4 of the island, much of it represented by Councillor Rhys Pugh, who you will hear from later, is farmland, is agricultural land. Almost all of it is very high grade land. It's alluvial soil. It's so good that when, for example, as at Westwood Cross, they develop farmland, they take the top metre of soil off and take it away and sell it. And we're losing, I mean, literally losing to sale from developments, our topsoil. Historically, Thanet has grown cabbages, cauliflowers, potatoes, as well as, of course, some livestock, sheep, and some cattle, but not very much. We cannot go on sacrificing our agricultural land to development unnecessarily because there are brownfield sites available. The government is at last coming around to my way of thinking, and policy has changed and is changing. And in a couple of weeks' time, I suspect you'll find the Minister of State at the Department for Agriculture making an announcement about how we need to be much, much more self-sufficient in the food that we produce, food that we eat, in order to avoid the CO2 costs of importing it, and also, of course, to try and make ourselves more independent of other countries. The particular site, the Shottendane Road proposed development, will make, there is no doubt about this, will make that farm unviable. And we have to understand that. The other developments that I mentioned earlier, Garlinge, Westgate, Birchington, and Brooksend Hill, successively will make other farms unviable because you have to have some economy of scale. We're not into prairie farming in Thanet. We grow good, relatively modest crops, but there has to be enough space to grow them. If we build over all of this farmland, which is in the local plan at the moment, then farming in Thanet will not be viable. Now, in the developer's submission, they said there was nothing of any notable heritage interest, and that the heritage aspects of this were of negligible significance. Forgive me, farming is part of Thanet's heritage. It's a part of our natural heritage. The farmland is part of our heritage. The environment, the habitat, is part of our heritage. And what we're talking about is destroying so much of this that there will be nothing left worth saving. And happily, that is an argument that I think I'm at last beginning to win with government. And again, it would be perverse if this and other developments in Thanet were allowed to go ahead at the very moment when government was saying, actually, hang on a minute, we need this farmland to grow our crops on and to protect our environment. I am astonished that the requirement placed initially by Thanet District Council, I believe, upon the development for an environmental impact assessment was scoped out because of the viability of the scheme. It is no longer considered worthy of consideration. I find that at best incomprehensible and at worst a disgrace. So for all of those reasons, I believe that not only is this proposed development of itself undesirable, but that the message that it would send out, were it to be allowed to go ahead, and you may or may not consider this to be a fair consideration, but the message that it would send out, were it to be allowed, would have a devastating effect upon the whole of the agriculture of the Isle of Thanet, the environment of the Isle of Thanet, and the infrastructure of the Isle of Thanet. So for all of those reasons, I believe that this application should be rejected. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sir Roger. That's a very, very helpful submission. Thank you. Obviously covers quite a lot of ground. Just a couple of questions from you mentioned 1973 floods and the June 2021 floods. And I have seen those sort of referenced elsewhere in some of the documentation. What did those, starting with the recent one, what did they amount to from your...
The recent one was significant flooding of the Shottendane road. And if you know the road, because the road is on the top end of one side of a valley, if you like, with the graveyard and the crematorium on one side, the water drains down that slope into these fields. It's not brilliant for the Margate Cricket Club, who find their pitch waterlogged on for rather too frequent occasions, because the club itself and a lot of the farmland is at the bottom of the valley. We don't tend to think of Thanet as being a place with hills and valleys, but effectively this entire site is located on either side of and in the bottom of the farm is located on either side of and in the bottom of a valley. That valley was flooded. In the 1973 floods, a much wider area with devastating effect was flooded. A lot of Westgate was flooded, as well as this entire site. And the Plenty Brook was, I understand, I've been around for a long time, but I wasn't here in 1973. And I'm told by those who were that the effect on the main sands of the flooding of the Tivoli Brook, sorry, the Plenty Brook is one in Herne Bay, which I have a similar problem with, was quite devastating. So I think the June 2021 incident was less severe, certainly, than the one in 1973, but both were significant. And I'm astonished that this is not referred to in the Kent County Council's submission.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Mr. Williams, have you got any questions of Sir Roger?
Thank you, Sir Roger. With respect, we'll take the same approach, thank you very much, and deal with it with our respective witnesses as we go through the various topics. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sir Roger. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, next on my list is